So that's where I'm supposed to stand. I can't move. That's not usually conducive to better performance, but I'll try. Presenting the work, and thank you very much for the invitation, presenting the joint work with Paweł Strzelecki, who is right now in Brussels doing aging work group, whatever thing. I'm just giving this evidence to support that we're not totally greenhorns here, even though we look greenhorns. And I also would like to make a very grateful acknowledgement to the support for this project from the project that we're all participating in the conference. In either case, the original idea that we had, if it works, was to go a little bit beyond what we already know about the effects of increasing effective retirement age due to reducing early exit opportunities in Poland. I know it's not very easy, but I'll try to make it very simple as soon as I get to some graphs. So things that we already know and that were also very nice summarized by John earlier is that activity rates were very low in Poland, especially among the elderly, and that minimum of eligibility retirement age, which I'm going to abbreviate by META, minimum eligibility retirement age, the one that is official and legal, wasn't that low compared to other countries. But the actual exit age was very low compared to other countries, and the source of that was a number of policies that were implemented in early transition that enhanced or encouraged early exits by giving all sorts of incentives to people in a number of professions. And started from few professions, but then it got spread and spread and spread. And then we were supposed to cut it down in 1997, and it took Agnieszka about 10 more years to actually cut it. We did, effectively. But the problem that this all leads to is that these early exits contribute to huge fiscal burden. And that fiscal burden translates to costs that we're still bearing. So this is a very important corollary that for the rest of the work. We're not going to find huge effects of this reform. And this is because we're only going to look at short periods of time. So you need to think about this form of reform as something that will accumulate expenditure kind of headcount over years. And that's why the fact that we don't find much result doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't important. But this is also why the policy relevance of the whole study is quite paramount. So the important part from this is that if people were supposed to retire early, they also had much less incentives to invest in skills. And if I could make a little comment on Vincenzo talked from just a second ago, there's a fantastic study from Denmark where they also have a much employee data, where they show there was a public sector training huge program for elderly workers. And actually people who decided to invest in skills stayed longer in the labor market, which is sensible because they could observe returns to their investment over a longer period of time. And that's basically the argument that's there. So in addition to fiscal perspective, there's also human capital perspective, which is of importance but may play different ways around. And also one last thing is we don't have kindergartens in this country, at least not as many as we would like to have. So if your if your mother retires early, she can sit with your kids, and that's something that helps to accommodate the costs associated with fertility. So the whole reform, so what is actually the achievement that it's done? Effectively, you could have retired 5 years earlier than the official minimum eligibility retirement age. Originally, this was constrained to a few professions, but with the time, it became a fairly popular phenomenon. And as of 2003, I think, or 2001, anybody who had sufficient experience, and sufficient experience was 25 years of work, anybody with that experience could retire at the age of 55 women, 60 men. And of course, there was an actual retirement. This was a pre-retirement scheme, and they were supposed to be cancelled, but they were prolonged every year and year and year. And that's what we've changed in 2009, or was changed in 2009. The reform effectively eliminated it for almost anybody, the opportunity to leave early. It applied what's called the medical criteria. So if your profession is really harmful to your health and you work in that profession for long enough, then you are eligible for something which we translate directly from Polish as bridging pensions. And this is the 5-year, still shorter period of time. But that's constrained to a really narrow population in terms of working force. And there was one consolation candy in the whole thing, which was if you happen to lose a job and you're in the pre-retirement age, you can get the pre-retirement benefit instead of being unemployed. And that's something that's applied 5 years short of the retirement age for everybody. So there's still a way to kind of exit. Get yourself fired, you can get a benefit, so to say. So you would, looking at this, you would say huge reform. And you should see a huge increase in activity post-2009. But there's also real world, and that real world is that there's been a changing structure in professions and sectors occupationally. There's been a changing structure in education. There's been a huge cultural change ever since post-1989. So what is really important, I drew the activity rate, actually number of active people here. And that's 2007, where you see the huge change in trend and the beginning of increase. And that's 2009, where you have the reform. Now, it would really take a lot of goodwill to say that this increase is very different from this increase. In other words, it's really hard to show there's a huge effect of the reform just from looking at this number. And that's basically the story. So the point is, politicians only started noticing increasing activity when it was about here. And so everybody started talking about huge effects of the changes in the minimum eligibility retirement age, which does not seem to be that well founded in the data. So what's our objective really? And let me first warn you, it's a very early stage of this research. We want to quantify the actual causal effect of the age reform on activity rates. Simple as that. So this graph shows you, don't look at the gray bars, that's the majority, but that's the majority that could not be affected by the reform when it was introduced, because they were too young anyway. So these are the numbers of active people in all these 10-year age groups. These were not very likely, so this is 50 to 55, 5-year age groups. This is 50 to 55. These people were not likely to be much affected because they were still younger than the early retirement age, but they could already try to kind of anticipate that they will not be able to retire early. This is people, here women could be already affected but not, and here everybody could be affected. And this is a shorter period of time, so it's just 2007, 2012, quarterly data. This is where the reform happened. I mean, look at this graph. Do you see anything? Not really. Right? It's hard to say that there's been a huge change, especially among the treated cohorts, that there's been a huge change in activity. We can also decompose that to different genders and age groups, and we did that, and don't look at the black bars, we don't care about them. This is total change in activity rates, and green colors are for men, and violet, or sorry, green and blue are for men, and violet and pink are for women. Obviously not non-standard approach. But the important part is you've got the affected cohorts in both detrimental and conducive part of the graph. So there's some switch all over the place, not really much pattern. There's another reason why the study that we want to do is not really easy, and that's the fact that there's a huge mess in actual legal arrangements still, even though there is this reform. So what we have is we can look at people even backwards and see if their pension would have been, if their eligibility for the bridging pensions would be off. So did they have the profession in 2007, say, that would entitle them to the bridging pension post-2009 reform? You see my point, right? So these four colors tell you exactly the story. So the blue bars are people who are not in the medical eligibility, so they can't do the bridging pensions, and they don't have the pension, but they are, this is what this graph shows, 5 years to official retirement age. Okay, so if you just look at this bar, this is 200,000, this is 1,200,000, so this is the population 5 years to official retirement age. And of these people, majority is not entitled to the benefits post-2009 and works. But that's exactly the situation that was there even before the reform. Then there is the whatever color, Bruges, whatever. People that didn't have the eligibility before, they would not, they had eligibility before, they would not have it after 2009, and are on a pension currently. Now, you would like that to disappear post-2009, so as of this moment you would like these people to go away. But as I already told you, if you happen to be unemployed and you can't, in 5 years period to your retirement, you're entitled to certain pre-pension retirement benefits. So this group doesn't seem to be going away. Now, there is then the green part, which is people with medical eligibility that did not take up their pension. And there is the yellow one, people with eligibility that took the pension. Now, there's very few people here, which means I'm also going to have very few observations in the data set if there's so few of them in the population. So it's really hard to look at the effects of treatment on the treated. What we can try to do is we can look at the treatment effects of the non-treated, and that's what we're actually doing. So before we do any economics, what I would like to show you is some animations. So this is males, this is their age, and this is the percentage of people, males, who have a pension. And this is drawn for different years. So 2002, 3, 4, 5, they all go on the same pattern. 6, 7, 8, they all go on the same pattern. Actually, there's some increase in taking up pensions in 2008 in the anticipation of the reform of 2009. Now, what you would like, the change of 2007. They could be as well thing. What you would like to see actually is as of 2009 that this thing moves to the right. 2009, 2010, 2011, 12, 13. Not much effect for men. These patterns, I mean there's some slight movement like this one, but it doesn't seem to be very large. Now do the same thing for women. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, boom, 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 boom. There's, a huge change for women. And that's happened exactly between 54 and 60. So if we're looking for any effect, any evidence, it's probably there. Can we say it's surely due to the reform? That's still a matter of discussion. So, one last graph to show you how difficult it is to find any treatment effects of this reform. This graph, this is the line, labor force participation of people who were never eligible to bridging pensions. Blue for people who stay to be eligible, and green for people who lose the eligibility. And that's the moment of reform. Now, normally there's a lot of going on. You see that, and historically there's been a lot of things going on. There's nothing going on after 2009. There's absolutely nothing happening here. Tough luck. So what do we actually do? And now I'm going to be very brief. We have two types of identifications. So we use Polish labor force survey data, and so that allows us to look at either rotating panel dimension or ask people about the labor force status a year before the participation in the survey. These two methods give fairly consistent results, so for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to show you the first one. So what we have in the labor force surveys, we have the birth year, and every quarter a person tells us if they had or hadn't birthday in that quarter before being inquired. Now that's not a very good identification from our perspective. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Then we also have information whether you have any source of income from pension, regardless of your activity. So even active people, even working people answer the question if they are having any income from pension, and we have no information on what type of pension that is. So we can't see. What's the real problem? So what's the caveat? The reform was like this. If you were in the right age with the right tenure on December 31st, 2008, you were eligible. If you had two first conditions, but you became certain age on January 1st, 2009, you were no longer eligible. So from an economist's perspective, a beautiful regression discontinuity design, and that's what we're going to do. But from data perspective, a thing that we find very hard to identify, because the surveyors of the Central Statistical Office who do labor force survey, they don't show up at people's houses on December 31st asking them if you already had birthday. They show up somewhere in the middle of the quarter. And the same happens for the first quarter. So we show up at people's houses on February 10th and we ask you what's your birth year and whether you already had birthday. But we can't say if that was December 31st exactly or January 1st. So this is fuzzy design for regression discontinuity, which introduces some technical issues, but that can be addressed. And then the second thing is this eligibility. So the medical criteria were very funny. So if you happen to be a surgeon, you were not eligible. But if you were a cardiac surgeon, you were eligible. Now, unfortunately, Labor Force Survey gives you a 4-digit code of your occupation, which doesn't tell what type of surgeon you are. So we can have too narrow or too strict definition depending if we take all of the similar occupations or throw all the occupations that are out. This is for the narrow occupations, so we really put it to the hard test. And one last thing why it's so hard to do it. So the point is people usually retire at retirement age, which means when you get to your retirement age, there's always discontinuity. So we're not looking for discontinuity per se. We're looking for a discontinuity which would be larger than you would see for people reaching retirement age otherwise. And that's the really tricky part. So how do we do it? Last 2 slides. Is it fine? How do we do it? So these bars show you, so first look at the left bars. So these bars show you what's the actual treatment effect of getting the right age on December 31st, 2008. Settlement sense on what I already said. This graph shows you what's the effect of getting the right age at the end of the quarter of any of the years that we're analyzing and being active afterwards. So I become eligible for pension on December 31st, 2007, and yet I stay in the labor market in 2008. That shows you there's some, not very small, but yet persistent, effect of the 4th quarter. It seems that people who become eligible for the pensions in December don't really retire as much as people eligible in March, and people eligible in June, and people eligible in September. For some reason, there is a seasonal pattern, and we have to be very careful for it, and it's extremely statistically significant. So there's just 1 year, 9 to 10 leapfrog, that was insignificant. Everything else was huge. I mean, that's the final result. So the treatment effect is computed as a ratio of 2 things that get computed. How many people actually become at hazard, at discontinuity, and what's the change for them. If you divide one by the other, you get the overall effect. So 81% of the people that were in the proximity of discontinuity lost their eligibility because of the change in the law. There's been an decrease in activity about 1.03%. Overall, there is a negative effect on activity of about 1.2%. So this is totally opposite of what you would like to see. You would like to see an increase in activity, and there is a decrease in activity. But it's just 1%. Don't worry. No matter what you do, if you stratify, it stays the same thing. It's still, for the treated, a huge effect. For the non-treated, no effect. That's what you would like to see. So, summarizing, we did not do this paper to show it was no point to do the reform. It's good Agnieszka left because you hear what I'm saying. I'm saying there could have been a lot of reasons to do this reform, but there's just little evidence it helped contemporaneously stimulating activity of these people. There is an increase in participation rates among elderly, and it seems to be driven by other phenomena, not necessarily by the change in law. What we intend to do is we intend to include education, information on training. We have that. There's not a huge population, as John said, but there is non-zero population. And we would like to test this idea of grandmothers taking care of their grandchildren. So we want to have family structure. We want to account for a spouse being retired or being active. That can be something that affects your individual decision much more than the law. And one last thing is we were thinking to look at whether your profession is decreasing or increasing. So if you're secure about your job, you may be not that interested in retiring, because you're sure you won't be fired. There's good prospects in your business, good prospects in your job. If that's not the case, then you could be more willing to take up unemployment. And pension benefit. And that's basically what we wanted to say. Thank you very much.